It's November 22nd, 1998, Las Vegas. Room 16 at the Oasis Motel on Las Vegas Boulevard. Not the glamorous stretch of the Strip, but the broken-down southern end where the neon has gone dark and the parking lots are cracked and the guests do not leave names. A housekeeper knocks on the door, no answer. She knocks again, still nothing. She uses her key. The room is dim, the television is on. On the bed, a small, thin man lies completely still. He is not sleeping. The man weighing perhaps 110 pounds, his face gaunt, his nose, once broken and rebuilt multiple times by cocaine, collapsed. His skin the color of old paper. On the nightstand, a cup of water. On the floor, nothing much. He looks to the housekeeper who steps back into the doorway and reaches for the phone like a man who has been dead for some time. She is correct. He has been. Stu Ungar, three-time World Series of Poker main event champion. The only player in history to win that title in 3 different decades. A man who, by his own admission, once had access to more than $30 million in poker and gin rummy winnings over the course of his life. 45 years old. Found alone in a $30 a night motel room with no money, no friends, no future. No one had come looking. This is the story of Stu Ungar, the most gifted card player who ever lived, and the man who could not be saved from himself. It began, as so many of the saddest American stories begin, in New York City, in a neighborhood where the cards were always on the table and the odds were always stacked against the house. Stu Ungar was born on September 8, 1953, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. If you have never spent time in that neighborhood in the 1950s and early 60s, it requires some imagination. It was not yet the gentrified version that a later generation would inherit. It was dense and loud and ethnically textured, full of recent immigrants and the children of recent immigrants, full of card games and sidewalk arguments, and small-time commerce conducted in back rooms and on stoops. It was the kind of neighborhood where a certain kind of intelligence developed young, sharp and streetwise, because the alternative was being taken advantage of, and nobody on the Lower East Side tolerated that. Stu's father, Isidore Ungar, known as Ito, ran a bar and card room called the East Side Bar and Grill. It was not a fancy establishment. It was the kind of place where men played gin rummy for money and nobody asked too many questions. Ito was well connected in the downtown criminal ecosystem, not a boss, not a heavy, but a man who knew the right people and kept the right company. He kept his son close. The boy watched. Stu was playing gin rummy by the time he was 8. Not the way children play games, with half attention and no strategy. He played the way surgeons work, with total concentration, total recall, and a capacity to process the visible information on the table and extrapolate the invisible information in his opponent's hand in ways that no one around him could explain. He did not learn a system. He was simply, from the beginning, built differently. His memory for cards was not something he practiced, it was something he had. He saw a card played and it was stored permanently in a mental filing system that never lost anything. By the time Stu was 10, he was beating men twice and 3 times his age at gin rummy in his father's establishment. The men were not playing gently, they were playing for money. They lost anyway. Some of them found it charming, others found it humiliating. All of them kept coming back to play a boy they could not beat, because that is what gamblers do. Then in 1964, when Stu was 10 years old, Ito Ungar died. A heart attack. Sudden. Gone. The man who had been the axis of the family's world, the bar, the connections, the money, the structure, all of it dissolved quickly afterward. His mother struggled. The family entered a period of genuine financial precarity, and Stu, at 10 years old, understood something that no child should have to understand quite that young. The only resource he had was inside his own head. He would have to use it. He used it constantly. Through his early adolescence, he was playing gin rummy in the card rooms and back rooms of the Lower East Side for real money. He was good enough, by his early teens, that grown men were losing significant sums to a child in a folding chair. By the time he was 16, he had essentially cleared out the market. There was almost no one left in downtown Manhattan who would play him for stakes that made the game worth his time. Word spread the way it always does in closed communities, and the word was simple. Do not play the Ungar kid at gin. You will lose. He was 17 when a man named Victor Romano, who was connected to the mob, began financing him. This was the arrangement that would define the first chapter of Stu's professional life. Romano and others staked him, sent him to gin rummy games across the city, and collected a cut of the winnings. It was not unusual. In the world Stu operated in, the backer and the player was the standard model. You had the talent, someone else had the capital, and you split the results. Stu always had the talent. Keeping the capital was a different matter, and that problem would follow him for the rest of his life. Through his late teens and into his early 20s, Stu Ungar became the most feared gin rummy player in New York. He was not merely good. He was something closer to a cheat, except he wasn't cheating. He was counting every card, tracking every discard, modeling every hand in real time with a computational speed that his opponents could only describe as unfair. Some of them accused him of marking cards. He wasn't. He didn't have to. Others asked him how he knew what they were holding. He would tell them, sometimes card by card, exactly what was in their hand. He was right, every time. By the mid-1970s, his reputation had preceded him so thoroughly that he had essentially exhausted his market again. No serious gin rummy player in New York would touch him. The games dried up. The stakers started looking for other investments. And Stu Ungar, somewhere around his 22nd year, began to look west. He arrived in Las Vegas around 1976. He was 22 years old, small, thin, electric, already carrying the particular kind of hunger that comes from spending your whole life being the smartest person in any room and knowing it. Las Vegas in 1976 was still transitioning, the mob era winding down, the corporate era not yet fully installed. The card rooms were populated by professionals who had spent decades at the tables and considered themselves, with considerable justification, among the best in the world. Within weeks of his arrival, Stu had beaten most of them at gin rummy. Within months, the same thing happened that had happened in New York. The market collapsed. Nobody would play him. He was too good. He had the uncanny and deeply uncomfortable habit of telling his opponents after a hand not just what they had been holding, but why they had played each card the way they did. He was reading the game 3 levels deep, while others were reading it 1. The gin rummy community of Las Vegas essentially agreed, quietly and without formal announcement, that Stu Ungar was not someone they would do business with. He was too expensive, and that was when he found poker. It was 1978. A friend watching Stu's situation with the gin community suggested he try the poker games that had been running at Binion's Horseshoe on Fremont Street. Benny Binion ran his establishment differently from the strip casinos. He catered to serious players. His World Series of Poker, which he had been running since 1970, was beginning to attract the legends of the game. Doyle Brunson, Johnny Moss, Amarillo Slim, Chip Reese. These were men who had spent their careers at the table and who believed, not unreasonably, that they had seen everything. Stu sat down to play poker for serious money for approximately the first time in the spring of 1978. Within 6 months, he was beating the best players in the city. The card memory transferred completely. Poker was a different game than gin, but the underlying skill set, reading incomplete information, modeling opponent hands, making mathematically precise decisions under pressure, was the same. Stu already had all of that. He just had to learn the game that was built on top of it. He learned fast, faster than anyone in that community had ever seen. Chip Reese, who was himself considered one of the finest players in the world, watched Stu at the table and later said that the young man played at a level that was simply not comparable to other players. Not better by degrees, different in kind. In 1980, the World Series of Poker was held at Binion's Horseshoe. The main event was No Limit Texas Hold'em, $10,000 to enter, open to any player who could pay. Stu Ungar entered. He was 26 years old. He had been playing poker for roughly 2 years. He had never played in a major tournament. He reached the final table. He played with a precision and an aggression and an intuitive grasp of tournament dynamics that left the veterans around him rattled. When the final hand came, he was heads up against Doyle Brunson, arguably the most famous and respected poker player alive. Doyle Brunson, who had won the World Series main event in 1976 and again in 1977. Doyle Brunson, who had written the definitive textbook on poker strategy. Stu beat him. He was the World Series of Poker main event champion, a player who had entered his first major tournament, a player who had been playing poker seriously for 2 years. The prize was $365,000. He came back the following year, 1981. He won again. The same tournament, the same final table pressure, a different field, the same result. Back-to-back World Series main event titles. He was 27 years old. He was the greatest poker player alive by any reasonable measurement, and almost everyone in the industry knew it. The money came fast. Not just the tournament prize money, which was substantial, but the cash game money. Stu played the biggest cash games in Las Vegas, games with hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table, games that ran for days, games where the participants were the wealthiest and most skilled players in the world. He won more often than he lost. He won enormous sums. The figure that circulates, impossible to verify precisely, is that over the decade of the 1980s, Stu Ungar won more than $20 million at the poker and gin rummy tables. By some accounts, it is higher. What happened to it is the other part of the story. Stu discovered cocaine sometime in the early 1980s. The drug was everywhere in Las Vegas in those years, threaded through the casino world, the nightclub world, the world of people with too much money and too much time and too little sleep. For most people who encountered it in that era, it was a problem that could be managed or escaped. For Stu Ungar, it was something else entirely. It fit the architecture of his mind in a way that made it immediately and catastrophically addictive. He could not moderate it. He had never moderated anything in his life. He approached cocaine the way he approached gin rummy. All in, all the time, no limit. His appearance began to change through the middle of the decade. The small, wiry energy that had always characterized him became something more ragged. The eyes that had always been sharp began to look strained. He stopped sleeping well. He started spending heavily on cocaine, on sports betting, on losing badly at things he was not as gifted at as he was at cards. He bet on golf, on horses, on football. He bet recklessly, the way a man bets when he does not quite believe that money is real. He had seen so much of it come so quickly that its departure did not alarm him the way it should have. He married. He had a daughter, Stephanie, whom he loved with an intensity that stood in strange and painful contrast to his inability to remain present in her life. Friends who knew him in those years described the relationship with Stephanie as the most human thing about Stu, the one place where the armor came off, where the genius-level detachment dissolved and something vulnerable and real appeared. He talked about her constantly. He talked about what he wanted for her, and then the cocaine would pull him back under and weeks would pass without contact. By the late 1980s, Stu was losing ground fast. The money was being consumed at a rate that matched and then exceeded his ability to earn it. He had backers, men who fronted him for cash games and took a percentage of his wins. But the arrangement required him to be functional. He was becoming less functional. His physical health was deteriorating in ways that were now visible. The cocaine had done significant damage to the septum of his nose, requiring surgical reconstruction. He would be reconstructed and would return to the drug, and the damage would recur. This happened more than once. The casinos began watching him differently. Not for cheating. Stu had never cheated, had never needed to. They watched him the way you watch someone you are concerned about. The man who had been the most formidable player in the building was now showing up looking like something had been consuming him from the inside. The precision was still there in flashes. The brilliance still emerged. But the consistency was gone. And in professional poker, consistency is everything. He was broke multiple times in the late 1980s and early 90s. Not broke in the way that people sometimes use the word loosely. Broke. No money, no cash, no chips, no resources. Friends and backers who had seen him through difficult periods before began to step back, not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion. They had lent money that had not come back. They had staked games that produced nothing usable because Stu had taken his winnings directly to the cocaine or directly to the sports book. The cycle was complete and undeniable. There was a period in the early 1990s where Stu essentially disappeared from the serious poker world. He was still in Las Vegas. He was playing smaller games, games well beneath his ability, when he could find someone to stake him, and when he was functional enough to sit at a table. The World Series of Poker came each spring, and he did not enter. He could not afford the entry fee. He could not find a backer willing to take the risk. He was, by every external measure, finished. What happened next, almost no one predicted. In 1997, a group of people who believed in Stu Ungar, despite everything, arranged a stake for the World Series of Poker main event. The key figure was a man named Billy Baxter, a legendary Las Vegas gambler and poker player who had known Stu for years and had, despite considerable evidence to the contrary, not given up on what he believed was still in there. Baxter, along with others, funded Stu's $10,000 entry fee. They negotiated his piece of any winnings. They got him to Binion's Horseshoe. The poker world that Stu walked into in May of 1997 had changed considerably since his last serious campaign. The field was larger. The players were younger. A generation of professionals had come up studying the game, reading books, developing theoretical frameworks. They had grown up hearing about Stu Ungar the way mythology works, as a historical figure, someone from the past. They looked at the man who sat down across from them and saw a hollowed-out version of whatever the legend had been. He was thin in a way that suggested illness. His face was not the face of a 43-year-old man. He looked, to the players who didn't know him, like someone's unwell grandfather. They expected nothing from him. He began playing. Within the first day, the younger players who had underestimated him were adjusting their assessments. He was reading hands. He was reading players. He was making moves that were not just correct but innovative, moves that the theoretical frameworks of the new generation hadn't cataloged because no one had thought of them. The memory was intact. The processing was intact. Whatever the cocaine had taken from him physically, it had not reached what was deepest in his mind. Not yet. He advanced through the field. Day after day, hand after hand, he was there. The tournament press began to pay attention. The older figures in the poker world, the ones who remembered him from 1980 and 81, watched with something between disbelief and reverence. He was doing it again, 17 years after his first title. After everything that had happened in between, he was doing it again. When the final table of the 1997 World Series of Poker main event assembled, Stu Ungar was at it. He played the final table with a patience and an aggression calibrated to the specific tendencies of each player sitting across from him. He knew what they had. He often knew before the betting told him. One player after another exited. The field narrowed. The chips consolidated. And at the end of it, Stu Ungar was the last man standing. 3 World Series of Poker main event titles. 3. No one else in history had ever done it. He stood at the table that had made him famous, in the casino that had witnessed his greatest triumphs, and he did not look triumphant. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had used the last of something to get to this moment, and wasn't entirely sure what came after it. He held the trophy. He collected the prize, $1 million. He was asked in the immediate aftermath how he had done it. He said something that many people in the room found difficult to hear. He said he had dedicated this one to his daughter, Stephanie. He said she deserved a father who was worth something. Within 12 months, the $1 million was gone, not invested, not lost at poker, not paid to lawyers or debts or creditors, though there were plenty of those. Consumed, spent on cocaine at a rate that most people cannot conceptualize. Spent on sports bets that had nothing behind them. Spent on the lifestyle of a man who cannot connect the money in his pocket to any meaningful future, because the future is something that exists only as an abstraction when the present is all-consuming. His friends watched it happen and felt the helplessness that attaches itself to watching someone self-destruct when they are determined to do so and are genius enough to resist every rational argument against it. Stu knew what cocaine was doing to him. He was not stupid. He was the opposite of stupid. He had sat at more tables, read more situations, and understood more about human behavior under pressure than almost anyone alive. He knew, and he kept using it anyway. The physical deterioration accelerated through 1997 and into 98. His weight dropped to alarming levels. His nose, already compromised from years of cocaine use, was now in serious decline. He was losing the ability to pass the physical that would be required to enter another major tournament. He told friends he was fine. He told his daughter when they spoke that he was doing better. He was not fine. He was not doing better. In October of 1998, he had a conversation with Mike Sexton, a poker player and close friend who had tried repeatedly over the years to help him. Sexton later recalled that Stu seemed clearer than he had in some time. He talked about getting clean. He talked about Stephanie. He talked about playing poker again, seriously, the way he used to. Sexton came away from the conversation with something that felt like hope. He had no way of knowing it would be the last real conversation he would have with Stu. On November 22nd, 1998, the housekeeper at the Oasis Motel called the front desk. Emergency services were dispatched. The paramedics who entered room 16 found Stu Ungar and determined that he had been dead for somewhere between 12 and 24 hours. The cause of death was ruled an accidental overdose, a combination of cocaine metabolites and a painkiller. Painkillers he had been prescribed for legitimate pain that had found their way into the same relationship with his body that every other substance had. He was 45 years old. When the news spread through Las Vegas, the poker world responded with the particular grief that attaches to the death of someone everyone watched failing, but no one could stop. The veterans who had played against him in his prime, the younger players who had watched him at the final table 16 months earlier, the backers who had believed in him and lost money, and believed in him again anyway. They all knew. They had known for a long time. But knowing does not make the arrival of the thing you feared any easier to absorb. His estate, when the accounting was done, amounted to essentially nothing. No property, no accounts, no investments, no insurance. He had earned, over the course of his career, figures in the tens of millions of dollars, and the total of what remained when he was found in room 16 was a few personal items and the clothes on his body. His daughter Stephanie, who was in her 20s by then, was left with memories and the particular grief of someone who had loved a parent who was never quite able to love himself back to safety. There is no monument to Stu Ungar in Las Vegas. There is no statue outside Binion's Horseshoe, which has itself since changed hands and changed names and changed form. The poker world has moved on in the way that worlds do, to newer stars and larger prizes, and a television audience that barely knows the name of a man who was, without serious dispute, the greatest card player who ever lived. But among the people who knew the game before the cameras arrived, among the old guard who played those cash games at the Horseshoe in the early 80s, who watched a 26-year-old kid beat Doyle Brunson heads up and couldn't believe what they had seen, who came back the next year and watched him do it again. Among those people, the name Stuart Errol Ungar carries a weight that no trophy or plaque could adequately represent. They will tell you that what he could do with a deck of cards was not a skill. It was not a technique. It was not something you could learn from a book or develop through practice. It was something he was born with, something that arrived fully formed in a Lower East Side kid whose father ran a card room and who discovered, before he was old enough to understand what he had found, that his mind was capable of things other minds simply were not. They will also tell you that the same quality that made him exceptional, the absolute intensity, the inability to operate at half speed, the all or nothing relationship with whatever had his attention, was the same quality that made his destruction inevitable. He couldn't be great at something without consuming it. He couldn't find a limit. He was built without the off switch that keeps most people safe from themselves. Stephanie Ungar has spoken publicly about her father in the years since his death. She describes a man who was, when he was present, extraordinarily loving, who called her his entire world, who meant it. She does not excuse what happened. She doesn't explain it away. She has simply continued to live with the particular shape of grief that comes from loving someone who could not save themselves. The Oasis Motel still stands on Las Vegas Boulevard, more or less. The room numbers have not changed. No one has put a plaque on room 16. No one is likely to. The last thing he ever won, the thing he dedicated to the daughter he could not be present for, was $1 million. It was enough to change a life. It changed nothing. He had no idea it would be the last table he ever sat down to. No one did. But maybe somewhere in the part of him that understood probability better than anyone alive, somewhere in the extraordinary machinery of a mind that could calculate the invisible from the visible, somewhere in there, he knew. The greatest card player who ever lived died alone in the dark, with the television on and not a dollar to his name. The cards, for once, had nothing to do with it.